Hi, everybody. Uh, thanks for coming. It's great, if slightly spooky, to be here. We're giving a panel on exactly the same venue as we were exactly a year ago, but it's very nice to be here and not to be with the same COVID restrictions as last year. My name is Daniel Howden. I'm the co-founder and director of Lighthouse Reports. We're an independent investigative newsroom working with media from around the world. And today we're going to be talking to you about a story that Lighthouse led, but we're going to be talking about a lot more than that one story. We're hoping to demystify a little bit the reporting on algorithms and how they're deployed in the public sector. It's a fascinating but frankly complex area of reporting, and I'm hoping that today, by talking about this story and hearing from the people who put it together and helped to support it into existence, that we can give people here some ideas on how to go and do some of this reporting themselves. And let me introduce the rest of the panel. To my right, I have Dhruv Mehrotra, who's an investigative data reporter with Wired magazine. To his right is Gabriel Geiger, who's an investigative reporter with Lighthouse and was our lead reporter on suspicion machines, which is the story that we're going to talk to you about and the area of reporting that we'd like to explain a bit more about. And on the far right is Marina Walker Guevara, who is with the Pulitzer Center, and they were kind enough to support Gabriel and the reporting in this area. And Marina's in a very good position to talk about the broader landscape of this kind of reporting, and we'll get to that in due course. I know that there are some people, even from my own team at Lighthouse, who are here in the room, who, like me, think about algorithmic accountability reporting as a kind of as quite a mysterious process. 3 years ago, I knew that this was potentially an incredibly important thing to be reporting on, how algorithms are deployed in public services around the world, but it wasn't necessarily clear to me how we would go about doing that reporting. So it's been a journey for me from a position of much more kind of traditional journalism, traditional reporting, to the final product that you're going to hear a bit more about. Inside those 3 years, there are a lot of lessons learned, and I think that it's a lot more doable than people would imagine. So for me, it's something that's hard, but it's probably a lot less hard than many people might think. But rather than talk too much in the abstract, I think it would be good to take a look at the kind of centerpiece story of this series that we've been doing, and that's a kind of good starting point for understanding a bit more. So I'm going to hand over to Dhruv and to Gabriel, and they're going to show us a bit of the story itself. Over to you guys.
Yeah, so just to start on this, when we took this project on 2 years ago to look at the use of algorithms in European welfare systems, we did so with the conviction that this type of technology is increasingly making life-changing decisions about some of the continent's most vulnerable people. These tools are often pitched as more fair, more objective way of allocating public resources, but the people who deploy them, the companies that build them, don't offer any avenue for public watchdogs to actually scrutinize those claims. And one of the things we wanted to do when we started this out was obtain access to at least one of these algorithms and run an experiment on it and test it, which is something that hasn't been done really before in journalism. So we sent requests out to cities all over Europe using freedom of information laws, asking for access to algorithms that they use to flag people for potential fraud investigations. And the results were pretty piecemeal, but one city, Rotterdam, did, after a 1.5 year long battle, give us access to their algorithm. And it's interesting politically because Rotterdam is the welfare capital of the Netherlands and has taken a quite punitive approach to welfare fraud. It carries out more investigations than any other city in the Netherlands on its welfare population. But in 2017, the people who were selected for these investigations changed. The city started using an algorithm built by the multinational Accenture to rank everyone in the city on a list based on risk of welfare fraud. And in order to assign people these risk scores, they used an algorithm that used 315 variables per person. And these variables included everything from people's demographic characteristics, their age, their gender, the language they speak, where they live, their proficiency in Dutch, to their relationships. How many past unmarried partners have they had? What was the length of their last romantic relationship? To social workers' subjective comments and assessments about them. How are they dressing today? Do they seem motivated? And all of those put together creates this risk score. And officials had a very clear pitch about what this system was. They said it wasn't biased and it never discriminated. And when we had access to this algorithm, we wanted to design an experiment to test those claims and see if they were true. And I'll let Dhruv take over and tell you a bit about what we found.
Yeah, so, simply put, what we found is that the algorithm discriminates largely based on gender and ethnicity. And we got to these findings by recreating and testing the actual model file that Gabriel was describing. This took a lot of data analysis and engineering, but the goal of the story from like an editorial perspective was to take this really complicated finding and algorithm, right, and present these findings in a compelling way that wasn't particularly technical, right, because the findings themselves are discrimination as we all can understand it, So it was a massive team effort, and I'm going to kind of scroll through the piece so you can get a sense of what we did, but it involved like a dozen people, I think, who really had their hands on this. The byline is sort of a small army. But it sort of shows you what you can do in a dream scenario where you actually have this transparency from Rotterdam as well as buy-in from a publication like Wired, who actually allocated quite a few resources to this. So let me walk you through the story a bit here. So it starts with, so there, as Gabriel might have mentioned, there's 30,000 welfare recipients in the Netherlands. And we start by kind of showing how how an individual's risk ranking might increase based on attributes like being young, being female, having children, until you hit sort of this threshold where you could be flagged for a fraud investigation. Then we sort of go through what we found, right? And sort of the TLDR here, right, is that there are certain variables and characteristics that have a sort of dramatic impact on a risk score in a positive or negative direction. So the way that we try to frame these findings, I think, it was sort of an editorial choice that we made, where we have hypothetical welfare recipients. So we sort of introduce these characters early on as Sarah and Yusuf. The left hand tells their story in prose, right? Imagine Sarah, hypothetical mother of 2 children, recently broke up with her partner, one of her sons is ill. And as we go through sort of Sarah's life, on the right-hand side, we show how the algorithm sort of flattens Sarah's experience into data points that the algorithm can then crunch. And we want to kind of juxtapose, right, like the complexity of an individual welfare recipient's life to what the actual algorithm evaluates. So we go through that with Sarah and Yusuf here. Similar thing, right? Yusuf is a fictional migrant from Iraq who came to the Netherlands. And we came up with these archetypes for characters based on the analysis we did, where we figured out, what are the salient variables that determine a risk score, right? And how do those variables interact with each other to, move someone into the threshold where they're going to be investigated for fraud. So this is Yusuf, and the way that we we settled on how to describe the process of how you move into a fraud investigation is we think about it from the perspective of an average welfare recipient. And how many of the attributes do we need to change for an average welfare recipient to make them look more like Sarah or Yusuf? How many attributes does it take for them to actually be flagged? So, for example, if you change Sarah's gender to a woman, that increases her kind of ranking in the list 4,542 spots. Same thing if she has 2 children, she moves up another 2,100 spaces. Another 3,000 spots because she's single. And these are all, findings that we came up with through our analysis, of course, but, we use this rhetorical device to actually make the outputs of the algorithm a bit more concrete. We do the same thing for Yusuf here. I think I can skip through this. Then we move on to, basically we wanted to open up the algorithm and look under the hood and see how this works. And the sort of simplest building block of this algorithm is a decision tree. It's basically like Rotterdam's algorithm is made up of 500 of these decision trees, and they categorize individuals based on a series of yes or no questions like this. At each question, you sort of travel down the decision tree until the algorithm will produce a score, right? So if you're female, yes, do you have children? Yes, do you live in more than 6 addresses? All this works together to produce a score. So that's what that looks like. And the final thing there's two more things I wanted to mention. Because we had a live version of the model, we also were able to let readers experiment with it. How do toggling certain variables and attributes actually affect someone's risk score, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. If this flash sale wasn't here, I think it would be a little bit more clear, unfortunately. Then the last thing we do is, for the piece, a big part of the analysis is that we had the training data. And we ran the training data through the model itself to produce the scores for 12,700 real recipients of welfare. And what we wanted to do was show the share of individuals in the high-risk threshold who have certain attributes, right? So this shows that basically, if you haven't passed your Dutch language requirement, you're twice as likely to show up in this high-risk, this high-risk decile or this threshold. Similarly, if you are a parent, you're 2 times more likely. So that's that's the story in a nutshell. And we can talk more about how we did it and the resources required and stuff like that as this goes on, I think.
Thanks, Dhruv, and thanks, Gabriel. There's nothing worse than having the people who put the story together talk about how it was received or if it was done well. But I think it would be useful, Marina, to ask you if you could summarize a little bit the response to this and where this fits into the landscape of efforts to do this kind of reporting.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone, and I'm sorry about losing my voice the first day of the conference. So it's amazing when somebody publishes an investigation like this that took 2 years and government officials come knocking on your door, not to push back and tell you that you suck, but to tell you, how do you do it and what can we learn from you? And that is exactly what happened to these people here. They are setting agenda because, unfortunately, so little is known, even by those that are implementing and deploying and buying these algorithms. And so they came to the team asking questions and requesting information, including, for example, the co-reporter of the AI Act, which is the main piece of legislation that is being considered today in the European Union. That, in addition to countless of people who wrote about this, and what they basically, researchers, academics, they frame this in terms of a milestone and a game-changing story, because really being able to obtain, as Daniel said, like the holy trinity of like the training data, the model, and the code is something that I don't think has been done before, or if it has been done, it has been only a few times. Now, what we need to do is to demystify how that happens, and also that that's not the only way that we go about AI reporting. So don't worry, I probably will never be able to get the Holy Trinity, or maybe we can, because now there's a precedent that these people have set in courts. But this was 2 years of being able to ask the right questions to the FOIA officers and pestering them until they started releasing the information little by little. And at some point, which I don't know if you said this, they accidentally enclosed a file that they didn't mean to enclose, which was the final piece of the Holy Trinity, or Holy Grail, and that allowed them to reconstruct this algorithm. But none of that would have happened without that pestering. For me, working with and being able to support Gabriel has been an amazing experience, and seeing him throughout last year talking to us about the different approaches, like saying, okay, now I'm going to be the nice guy to these FOIA officers, I'm going to use all the charm, and then a few weeks later, it's time to deploy the mean guy and the you don't mess with me persona. And that's how you do this reporting. But not only that, I also want to highlight the storytelling that you were able to see a little bit now with Dhruv, how fantastic is investigative reporting, but it's explanatory, and we need to explain the hell out of this story because nobody understands it, and so we need to make it as simple as possible, and in this case, creating this archetype, these two personas, Maria and Yusuf, and being able to basically have people understand what a decision-making tree algorithm is without even telling them that you're talking about an algorithm, just walking them through the inner workings of how these systems work and select and classify people and discriminate. So that is fantastic. Kudos to Wired and all. Another thing that I would highlight is the cross-border approach. They didn't do this in isolation. This is not something that is just happening in the Netherlands. It's happening in all countries around the world. And so they brought others in the ride, doing cross-border reporting, coaching their colleagues in other countries, where they didn't obtain the Holy Trinity, but they were able to highlight and do other kinds of reporting that we all can do, such as talking to people the bureaucrats who are tasked with deploying the algorithms, and half of them don't understand them, and the other half say, it's not really effective, it's making us waste a lot of time. And so all of those pieces of reporting, I think, is what is going to make this investigation memorable and will, in my view, provide a blueprint for all of us who want to continue doing this kind of reporting. The final thing I would say is the peer review process. There's a lot of technical knowledge here, and what these guys did is they asked people in other disciplines to apply pressure to their investigation, to see where it fails, where the weak points were, to protect themselves, to bulletproof the work so it cannot be attacked and it can serve as a blueprint for others.
Thank you, Marina. That's both kind and helpful. So far, we've talked a lot about where the reporting led us in Rotterdam on a specific algorithm. But this was part of a long-term reporting series that went to a lot of countries and took a lot of different approaches to trying to understand this topic. Yes, Rotterdam delivered the most complete kit from which to build a story. So the centerpiece story that we did with Wired focuses on Rotterdam. But we did a series of 4 pieces with Wired. We also worked with other media in the Netherlands in order to do the storytelling and some of the reporting as well. Gabriel, you were a younger and different person at the outset of this reporting. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey into this? because being here at the end of it, it is as though we already knew exactly what we were looking for at the beginning. But there's a big kind of process of learning that goes into this, and also the results of this reporting are beginning to come out with different stories in different countries. Could you take us a little bit through the journey and bring us up to date on the stories that go beyond this series, as important as this was to us?
Yeah, I mean, there was a big learning curve, and we started this with like pretty, I guess, big ambitions. First of all, we wanted to do this sort of technical audit, but we had 3 other axes that we wanted to report on. We wanted to show the stories of humans and communities that have been affected by these systems. We wanted to outline the market of companies that were market making, selling these systems. And we wanted to outline the political currents that were driving their adoption. And it took a kind of long time to find our way through that, mainly because we were working in different national contexts, and those 4 different axes are not the same in those different national contexts. And you know, ultimately those 4 axes became the model for the Wired package. And for example, when we looked at the human stories of people affected in Rotterdam, we teamed up with Vers Beton, which is a Rotterdam magazine, who did some really excellent community-level reporting there to figure out what were the consequences of, in this case, single mothers, mainly of a migration background, who are constantly in the crosshairs. And I think one of the maybe takeaways from this, and kind of working on this across these different axes, is, you know, algorithmic accountability reporting is not just technical reporting. It's also reporting for community level shoe leather reporting. It's for business desks and politics desks as well. And I think it's a really important time to be doing this work, because not only is this technology increasingly making these decisions about people, but also, like Marina mentioned, we're in this kind of potentially landmark regulatory moment. And that's why we're continuing to do it. And we're going to be doing a series of national stories that go beyond the Netherlands. Last week we did a series with El Confidencial about an algorithm in Spain that profiles people's health and attempts to figure out if they're lying about being ill and receiving sick leave benefits. But I think one of the sort of biggest takeaways for me is you don't have to have all these ingredients for every single algorithmic accountability story you do. And there's different ways and ins into these stories. And to give an example from the series, one case study we looked at was Denmark. And with Denmark, we wanted to use it to try to understand the political currents that were driving these systems, and how looking for political scapegoats had essentially enabled the benefits agency there to create an algorithmic Frankenstein monster that tracked everything from people's travel movements to, you know, third world countries they were connected to you know, who they may be sleeping next to at night and be in a, you know, a romantic relationship with. So yeah, there's a lot of different ins into this, and there doesn't have to be one template. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabriel. And there's a few other things there that we can unpack. I would say that we're continuing this reporting in the UK, in Ireland, in Sweden, in Italy. There are stories that are going to come fairly soon in Sweden. There's more reporting that we've been doing in France. We may continue to report on this in Spain. So we are looking for more partners, and will continue to be open for collaborating with other journalists on this. But I think it would be useful as well to hear a little bit from Dhruv and then from Marina. Dhruv, you have this cool job title. You're an investigative data reporter. Can you tell us a little bit more about what other? I mean, we've just talked about what you do with when you get. I mean, it's variously called the Holy Grail or the Holy Trinity. If you could kind of briefly recap for us what that is, and then talk about what are the kinds of stories you can do with things which fall short of that, but are nonetheless kind of really important reporting insights that can be used to build interesting stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think this story is remarkable because of the access that we had, right? The Holy Trinity that we keep referring to is, the inputs of the model itself, the algorithm, right? And then the outputs, right? So the outputs being the individuals at the end of the fraud investigation, right? Or the risk scores, right? But I've definitely done algorithmic accountability stories with just one of these pieces. I think you can tell a really compelling story with just the outputs of an algorithm, which is, for example, I did one about predictive policing. Aaron Sankin is in the room. He worked on it with me. But we basically had all the predictions made from one crime prediction software that's used widely in the United States. We did not have the algorithm. We did not have the underlying crime data, though we did eventually get some of it. But we were able to tell a story about, okay, where does this algorithm send cops to patrol? And that's enough to tell a really compelling story about disparate impact in certain communities in the United States. We didn't need the algorithm to do that. Similarly, you can tell stories with just inputs, right? I think biased inputs affect the outputs of an algorithm. So if you can prove the input data of a particular government algorithm, it isn't representative of the population as a whole, you might be able to produce a compelling evidence that an algorithm is flawed or biased. So yeah, you don't need all three pieces to do this type of reporting for sure. And again, oftentimes the story isn't even really about the algorithm itself. It's about the underlying system and the ideologies that it perpetuates, right? The system that we ended up looking at here is a punitive welfare system, and it kind of, the fact that it targets some of society's most vulnerable for fraud investigations as opposed to targeting these individuals for actual additional benefits tells you a lot about how these government systems work and the ideology behind them. So, these aren't algorithm stories. They're stories where I think for Wired's point, and my point of view actually, and why I like doing this work is that the technology is sort of how you get your foot in the door to tell a larger story about systems.
Thanks, Dhruv. Marina, Pulitzer Center supports other AI accountability fellows in addition to Gabriel. Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of approaches and kinds of stories that are coming out of that work? What are the other fellows finding out there?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to do a little bit of take a step back where we are. We all went through this doom and gloom, and AI is going to kill us all, or is going to save us all with a magic wand. When ChatGPT and other chatbots came out, lots of really hyped reporting or celebratory reporting or a lot of confusion. So what is the landscape in which we are trying to do this reporting? AI is infrastructure. When AI is everywhere and it's infrastructure, like Karen Howe says, one of the leading reporters in this field, it becomes invisible. And that's why it's so hard to, even for reporters to imagine sometimes what are the stories that they need to be pursuing. Underserved communities are affected disproportionately, so there's a big equity question here. Regulation is non-existent or is developing, as we said. There's an imbalance of knowledge in journalism with a lot of the resources to do this kind of reporting concentrated in corporate media or specialized media, and there's a lack of diversity in AI reporting, kind of reproducing what we're seeing in the AI industry. So what can go wrong with all of that? We have been talking a lot to journalists around the world at the Pulitzer Center because we are trying to do something that helps and doesn't have unintended harms. So what the journalists are telling us from 48 countries is what you see here in the slide. We experience a gap in our literacy, even in the basic concepts to approach this reporting. Obtaining data is difficult, as we have seen here. Who has 2 years to go through these lengthy processes? Access to algorithms, access to contracts, and so on. The AI companies are being legalistic and are deploying PR firms and even lawsuits in the United States. We have had examples of media companies being sued by AI companies for writing about them. And lastly, they said, like, we need mentors, we need others who have done this work who can lead the way. A little bit with this input is that we decided to create a space where we can support journalists, help diversify the field of AI reporting, help with those journalists redefine what it means to be an AI reporter, who gets to be an AI reporter, take the AI reporter out of the tech desk, and help, what we say here, AI is in everyone's beat. If you're covering farms, if you're covering farms or businesses or medical issues or the criminal justice system, you have your work cut out for you, because all of those fields are being completely turned upside down by automated systems. There are humans that are being replaced by these systems, and these systems are being deployed most of the times without major testing or without really knowing the context in which the systems are being applied. So we're trying to create the conditions for cross-border and cross-discipline reporting. Yes, we don't need to know to be technologists, but we need to know how to associate with ourselves with those who have that specialized knowledge, so we can, again, bulletproof our reporting. And finally, the other pillar of the work that we're trying to support is radical sharing of methods and data, so we can all continue building this field in a way that is equitable and that is sound. Some examples, we created a fellowship, and Gabriel, as I said, was part of this fellowship. Here are some of the fellows at work, just learning together, dissecting their stories, and trying to find commonalities among the reporting they were doing in 10 different countries. So examples of approaches, I mentioned Karen Howe before. She's been doing this work longer than most. She came to us with an idea of investigating AI colonialism, how AI is in some ways reproducing the old colonial order. Initially, Karen was going to do this story by herself in 5 different countries. And very soon she realized that she was going to be much better served working with local reporting partners in all of those countries, using the well-established cross-border collaborative methodology. Her story really, with that approach, helped understand that supply chain of labor that underpins the AI industry, from New Zealand to Venezuela, South Africa, and more. The community-centric aspect that Gabriel mentioned is so important. When we don't have data, when we don't have the technology, we always have the humans, and ultimately, this is about humans that are being harmed in some way. I want to emphasize here the work of Varsha Bansal, an Indian journalist who has been reporting a lot about the gig economy in India, which is huge. And her main sources, and amazing sources, have been these Uber drivers who are experiencing all kinds of issues with Uber's facial recognition technology, because guess what? It doesn't work well. So if their skin tone is a little bit darker, if their features are a little bit different, it locks these drivers out of their apps, and they can be weeks or months without work. At some point, she was so successful in developing the sources that she created a survey, because so many Uber drivers wanted to talk to her. The survey went viral, and she went from having no data to having a full data set based on this survey to go on. And another, just quickly, that I wanted to highlight is Lam Tui Vo's investigation into citizen neighbors, these applications where like people are going into panics, like neighbors are talking to one another about things that they suspect are happening. There's a lot of like social panic that is being fueled with these apps. And that's what Lam was focusing on. But then she started talking to the Asian American community. She's also Asian American. And what she discovered by being really connected to this community, is that they said, guess what? We actually, in this moment in the US, where the Asian American communities experience a lot of hate and like physical attacks in the street, we feel safe using this app. It gives us a sense of community. It alerts us about things that are going on. So I remember Lam calling me and saying, I think I lost the story. There's no story here. And I said, I think you got a better story. this is a complex story. This is not about evil technology and victims. This is about all the complexities that happens when technologies are deployed in complex and diverse communities. So she ended up going with that, and her work has been really amazing. And finally, when you can't get the data, maybe you can get the communications. And this was the case, the communications between the companies trying to sell the data and the officials trying to acquire it. Ari Sen, also from the network, was investigating Social Sentinel, an application that supposedly prevents self-injury and suicide in colleges. But by FOIA-ing, by obtaining the records of the communications between the company and the colleges, he realized that in reality, what they were trying to sell was this technology as a surveillance tool for unrest and social protests in college campuses in the United States, which is pretty amazing. And he would have never found out had it not been for the idea of like, okay, don't give me the data, let me see what you guys are talking about. Impact we talked about has been swift in many of these investigations because there's no regulation. And so basically the regulators and officials are taking note from the journalists and quickly trying to address some of the most egregious findings. I don't want to end without mentioning the harms that we can create without intent. And one of the most obvious one is using this kind of harmful and stereotyping images. Is the easiest thing you can do. I have an AI story, how do I illustrate it? Boom, the robot, the humanoid robot. And raise your hand if you haven't done it. We've done it. When we started learning about this, we went through a website and we were like, oh, we found a robot, let's replace it. So very easy fix. There's a guide called Better Images of AI. You can find it very easily on Google, and is done by a cross-discipline group that took the pain of putting together images that can be used by everyone and that are much more diverse and that actually highlight the human behind the systems instead of highlighting robots or other stereotypes that help fuel just like the wrong idea of what AI is and will do. Careful also with the lawsuits. We said we can talk more about this in the conversation. And also letting you know that at the Pulitzer Center we have opened just a few days ago the call for applications for the second cohort of AI Accountability Fellows. And we look forward to working with you. If you're interested, send us a proposal, reach out to us. This year we have an additional interesting thing, which is a partnership with Digital Witness Lab. It's a new initiative at Princeton University led by Surya Mathu, formerly with the Markup. And Surya and his team are investigating WhatsApp. So if you are interested in how WhatsApp is influencing public discourse in your community or maybe fueling misinformation, you can apply with a project specifically focused on WhatsApp, or you can apply with other projects. Here are some of the benefits and also the promise of having a lot of fun working with
I'm getting waved at that we had 10 minutes to go, so I just want to cover a couple of quick questions because I'd like to leave a little time in case people here in the room would like to ask questions. Just for really quick answers, and in asking for quick answers, I realized that the first of these questions is a bit unfair. Gabriel, you worked with the data team, which is a data editor who's a very experienced data journalist, and at different times the two other data scientists who were supporting this. This is internally at Lighthouse. Dhruv has the investigative data reporter job title, but you've moved around between quite a few different kinds of reporting in this. How do you think about what kind of reporter you are? Because it's quite relevant to people here in this room thinking about, well, is this work I could do? Are my skills relevant to it? Could you just think out loud about what kind of reporter you are? And it's fair enough if you're not, you don't have to settle on what that has to be called.
I mean, I probably edge towards being more of a traditional reporter, but I think with this type of project and something that I found sort of fun to do was, I mean, even if a lot of this data stuff is just going over your head, because I'm not a statistics person, I mean, I tried to engage with it as much as I could and, you know, be okay with just asking really dumb questions and feeling really stupid all the time. And yeah, I think that's something that, like, people in the room who maybe feel like more traditional reporters, I think that's something that you can take away. I mean, it's also okay to kind of feel stupid and ask dumb questions. And you can help, I mean, it's something that you need both of, because while, you know, the data team, you know, had the stats and everything down, they didn't have any of the sort of contextual information about Rotterdam, and a lot of times they didn't really understand what some of the data actually meant. So in the end, we kind of needed each other to be involved in this process. I don't have a name for my type of reporter, so I'll think about it.
That's fair enough. And Dhruv, there is a bit of skepticism among editors I know about whether these kind of, you know, when you say 2 years and big teams and all of this stuff, and you can be thinking, well, is this worth it? I mean, obviously, it's not about producing one story, but can you tell us a little bit about how this story went from Wyatt's perspective? And then we're going to move to questions from the floor.
Yeah, Wired has never done anything like this, to be quite honest. We've never done an algorithmic investigation of this magnitude. And I think the best indicator for how it did is that people have been revisiting the story a lot, and people spend a lot of time on the page, right? It means that basically they're spending the time to read it, and then they're going back and they're playing with the toggles and trying to understand it. You know, people have clicked, we published with this story a pretty detailed methodology of how we actually did it. We see that people are clicking through to that. But in general, I think the story did quite well. And when you look at, I think the most sort of heartening thing I see when I look at internal Wired stats, which is like something I do for my own job security, I tend to do that just to see how my own stories do. But something that I see that really heartens me is that you know, I see a lot of universities including it in their syllabus. So while, like, you know, maybe this didn't get many, many millions of reads or something like that, it seems that, you know, with this story, we've paved a way for a model for other types of algorithmic accountability reporting. And I think that's super useful and really valuable.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions for the panel? Do we have a microphone? There's questions over there. And if you could just briefly say who you are at the beginning of the question, please.
Yes, I met. Works? 1, 2. It works? Yeah. Okay. Thomas Midrin, I'm a colleague from Swiss Television. I followed. I was based in Brussels. The Rotterdam story and the problems with the Dutch social security. What I don't understand is, if we're talking about some public authority or government and so on, how can they keep an algorithm closed? Can you use the transparency legislation in order to request that the rules of the algorithm are made public? And in the European Union, there is a debate going on, and there are proposals being made about the transparency of artificial intelligence, although they are not yet turned into law. Thanks.
Gabriel, I'm going to put that one over to you. The short answer is yes, they should be obliged. The long answer is, Gabriel, can you tell us what excuses they use to say no?
Yeah, I mean, we've asked in 8 different countries, so I have a pretty good survey of the different excuses. The most common one that we run up to in the case of these particular type of algorithms is that they argue if they disclose the system, people who are trying to game the system or defraud the state will essentially have a roadmap to evading the controls. So most FOIA legislations have a sort of exception for the prevention of crime. The second one we see, which is the most difficult to argue against, is when the algorithm is private IP from a private vendor. So then you're essentially locked out if it's out-of-the-box software. The third one we see when it comes to things like training data is data protection laws. yeah, those are usually the ones we see. And then sometimes it's just bad faith stuff. Sometimes they say, well, code is not a public document, this type of stuff, yeah.
Yeah, the UK is currently the winner of the worst country in Europe on that score as well as others. Other questions? Here in the front? Sorry, the microphone landed with the gentleman with a beard back there.
I've already got the microphone here. Is it working? My name is Ben Ryan. I'm a neuroscientist, not a journalist, from Stanford, California. And I just want to say first, I applaud this work. I think it's amazing seeing this complex, statistical modeling presented in a very clear, accessible, and essentially open access format is wonderful. So I just want to ask the panelists to kind of opine on the idea of, or my question, which is, do you think this type of data-driven reporting should become more ubiquitous, and this is should become more pervasive, or is this like a niche thing? Because for me, I see something like this, and I find it very compelling. So my thought is, my question is, do you feel the same way, or am I just a scientist?
Dhruv, should you be more ubiquitous?
Yes, I think this reporting is super necessary and it should be more ubiquitous. I think we've talked a bit about sort of the difficulties here of doing a really technical and rigorous analysis, but to do this type of work, you can also work with experts, with statisticians. You don't have to do this all alone, but short answer is yes, I also find it fascinating, and I hope to see much more of this analysis. And of course, the Markup, if you don't know them, is a newsroom that sort of does this regularly, and they produce reproducible findings and for all of their investigations into algorithms.
Can I add just a quick question? Somebody said that every reporter should be a climate change reporter, given what climate change means to humanity. I believe that every reporter should be an algorithmic accountability reporting, which doesn't mean to be a technician or a technologist, but just understanding how the system works and how harms happens in all beats. So how do we start? We start with with our own beat. What happens in the area that I am an expert? How are algorithms influencing this area of reporting?
Thank you. Imogen Piper, Washington Post, Fisher Forensics. First, just want to say such an excellent investigation and storytelling as well. So it's so shocking to see such a sequential ranking system. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this was being deployed by the authorities and whether you spoke with people who were victims of algorithmic bias in this case.
Gabriel, over to you, and do mention, this is a safe space, we can also mention a few things that we're seeing outside of Rotterdam. I don't want this conversation to focus purely on Rotterdam, and I think we should at least take 2 seconds to celebrate Rotterdam for making the disclosure that it did as well.
Yeah, so essentially every year they ranked everyone on this list and they picked the top, roughly 1,000 every year for these investigations. And essentially during these investigations, if they find any sort of minor infraction of the rules, you can have your benefits, and the rules are quite complex, you can have your benefits chopped for months or, entirely, which obviously for people on benefits can have life-changing implications. And with Wired and Fairs Baton, we tell some of the stories of people who experience that. In more extreme cases, it can also mean fraud investigators raiding your house at 5 a.m., like one woman we spoke to, and searching through your laundry and counting your toothbrushes. So it's an incredibly punitive process.
Maybe one last question, the lady here in the front. Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to say thank you to the panel. Do come and visit lighthousereports.com, where we have detailed explanations about the investigations we do, or listen to the Backlight podcast that we produce, where we interview the reporters behind these kinds of investigations, and reach out to us. We are open to work with people from all sorts of different media or different reporters. So yeah, do get in touch. But thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks again to the panel.
Hey, just a little communication. I just wanted to ask you to leave quickly the room.